Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is William Sposato. William is a writer and media specialist with 25 years of experience in broadcast and print journalism and more than 10 years as a media trainer and PR professional. He is the co-author of the book Collision Course, Carlos Gohsm, and the Culture Wars that upended the auto empire. William, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Should I say good morning because you are in Japan and we are, 11 hours difference right now?
Yes, it's morning here. It's about 9 a.m., so not too bad. One of the downsides of living in Asia is that much of your work takes place either in the early morning or late at night to try and catch up with the rest of the world. So it's one of the professional liabilities of being in this region, but otherwise it's a great place to be.
Yes, my friend works for China right here in Montreal, and she's always waking up very early or going to bed very late. So I can understand that. William, before we get to the topic of the book, which there is a lot to cover, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where are you from to start off with? How you ended up in Tokyo? How is it that you became a media specialist? Just overall a picture about you.
Certainly. Very quickly, I was born in the New York area, just north of New York City. Went to university out in California at Stanford University many years ago. And now it was back then a somewhat unusual move to go from the East Coast all the way out to Stanford for college education, but it was a great opportunity. And then when I graduated, I moved to London for a few years to be a freelance radio reporter. And then did that for 3 years, moved back to New York and took a job with CBS News in New York. Sorry about that. Should I start that part over again or just keep going? Okay. Very sorry. So I did 5 years with CBS and then switched to print and went to Reuters news agency and was the correspondent for New York and then the New York bureau chief for a while. And it was that opportunity actually that got me to Japan. I had never actually been in Japan. I had never worked in Asia anywhere. And they were looking for a new Tokyo bureau chief for Reuters. So I applied and strangely enough got the job. And so that has now meant 23 years in Asia, most of it in Japan, but also 2 years in India as South Asia editor for Reuters. So a lot of fun, a lot of experiences. I moved from journalism then, left Reuters, into public relations and consulting, which is a fairly standard move to make. Somewhat unusually, after about 5 years, it was very interesting work, but after about 5 years, I decided to go back into news and joined the Wall Street Journal here in Tokyo, where I was deputy bureau chief for about 5 years. And now I'm sort of semi-retired and I do a little bit of both. I write for Foreign Policy magazine as a contributor. And obviously the last year has been consumed with writing and working on the book.
Okay, and I also happen to visit your website. So in your business as a media trainer, your business is in the US or in Japan or a mixture of everything?
It's really just Japan, and it's a part-time work, but basically it's helping Japanese executives who need to be able to communicate better and helping foreign executives here to understand the media in Japan and how to do interviews. So it's sort of standard media training, but it's really necessary for people who are trying to cross that cultural barrier, which is what we also talk about in the book quite a bit, right? The cultural, the corporate culture problems really do come up in the whole Nissan story.
Okay, to stay in this one more second, could you give us an example of something going terribly wrong because they don't have any media training, and on the other side of the coin, something going very nice, smoothly because they decided to hire someone like you to train them and survive the different cultures?
That's a very interesting question. On the negative side, unfortunately, you can see it quite frequently. If you look at most Japanese CEOs, they have a tough time getting their point across. Japan tends to be a self-deprecating culture. People don't tend to boast. And so therefore, that can look like a negative point of view. And it can look like you really don't know what you're doing or that things aren't going well. But in actual fact, the reality is usually much stronger, much better. So getting your positive points across is always part of the issue here. And even Japanese government spokespeople are having a tough time to some extent, say, against, if you look at the Chinese foreign ministry is today, these days, very strongly putting out its messages. It's called wolf warrior diplomacy. And how should the Japanese diplomats react to that, right? You don't want to necessarily mimic the same ideas, but at the same time, you have to have a stronger voice. On the positive side, somebody like Carlos Gohsm was brilliant. He was able to cut across the cultures and to have an ability to listen to the Japanese, but then be able to really put forward a very strong message. And it really did resonate. As a foreigner, when he first arrived in 1999, he was really able to, through a series of speeches, get his messages out. And it was quite powerful.
Well, I wonder what's the perspective of the Japanese when they see CEO rock stars like, I don't know, Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, Warren Buffett, Jeff Bezos, who seem to be like they have the whole power of the corporation and they take the whole credit, or in the eyes of the public, versus the system of the Japanese that I believe is more like a community. Can you tell us a little bit about that perspective?
Yes, absolutely. You're very much correct on that. The Japanese CEOs don't tend to put themselves forward. They will typically not stay in the job all that long. They rotate. And the view is it doesn't really matter who's in charge because it's a group effort. It's a group of executives at the very top who are deciding policy. And indeed, a lot of the policy making is actually pushed down to the more junior level, and people are allowed to get on with the work. That can be very useful. If you look at Toyota, Toyota is hugely successful in making sure everything gets better every single day. But they don't have what I would call magnetic leadership at the top. On the other hand, there are some Japanese companies that are emulating the foreign style. So SoftBank is a company that's becoming increasingly well-known. Masayoshi Son is obviously a charismatic leader. Uniqlo, fast retailing, the apparel chain, Tadashi Yanai, is quite a strong figure as well. But still, it is much more of a group mentality. And that has not really changed that much over the years. But what has happened is the perception of that has changed. So in the 1980s, when Japan was doing very well, that approach was seen as unbeatable, right? We can't compete with that. It's like this group of automatons all going out to get us, this army. But then in the 90s, when the Japanese economy was in huge trouble, and even today, it's seen as cautious, risk averse, indecisive, unable to make decisions quickly enough. So it's more the outside perception of Japan that's been changing over the years rather than the Japanese themselves in some ways.
Okay, and now continuing talking about culture, when Carlos Gohsm arrived, he fired a whole bunch of people from Nissan. He was called the cost killer. And in a culture where people are literally married to their jobs, that it's work there, what I forgot, from 6 in the morning to 9 at night and 6 days a week. In that culture where work means everything, I wonder how he was perceived or how those actions were taken.
Yes, that was probably one of the biggest challenges he faced. And indeed, part of the problem was it wasn't just Nissan at that point. Many Japanese companies at that time were in deep trouble, and the jobless rate was starting to move up. Now, by global standards, it was still very low. It peaked around 5.5%. right around that time. But for Japan, that was quite high. They've been used to unemployment rates of 1% or 1.5%. And so for Ghosn to make those job cuts was indeed somewhat controversial. But one of the things he did was, instead of just cutting the jobs, he moved them to offshore providers, right, to suppliers. And so he was able to sort of reduce the pain to some extent. But also, I think everyone realized at that time that drastic action was indeed necessary. And indeed, as an outsider, he had the opportunity to do that a Japanese boss probably could not have done. That the Japanese would expect an outsider, a foreigner, would probably take sort of negative action. But when they started to see the results, the perception was much more positive. So he pulled it off. He managed to do it. The job cuts were large, but they were not devastating. He didn't cut 20% of the company. But he did indeed introduce cuts. Just as seriously, he also squeezed the supplier network. Now, in Japan, there's a system known as keiretsu. Keiretsu means that you work together as a group. And this means that your suppliers, yourself, your bank that provides the money, are all sort of banded together in a loose affiliation. And so you don't tend to push your suppliers. If you're a supplier, you don't charge the most that you can of your customer. Even though you may have a part that is in huge demand, you say normally, okay, I can raise the price of this. They really need this. It's a long-term relationship. And that's a cliche, but it really is true. So Ghosn also broke the model by going to the suppliers. He cut many of the suppliers from their relationship with Nissan, reduced the number, and pushed them down to get them to be more cost efficient. Apple is the perfect example of this today. It's not confirmed, but some say that Apple goes to its suppliers and says, every year you have to cut your price by 5%. Find a way to do it. I don't care. You just figure it out. So that's a much different approach than the Japanese have. Toyota never quite went down that road and were criticized for that. But if you look at the recent supply shocks that have hit the auto industry today, right, where they can't build cars because of the lack of a small semiconductor, a small microchip, Toyota has been in much better shape because they kept their relationships, they kept the inventories that they needed because they knew after the big earthquake of 2011 here that there could be supply chain disruptions. So it's a two-sided coin. When it all goes well in a lean system, it's all fine. But when it goes badly, it can go very badly.
Right. Okay. So to put some of the listeners up to date, well, Carlos Gohsm, in case they haven't heard, is this amazing superstar CEO that was the CEO of two companies, Renault and Nissan, and Mitsubishi at a given moment. And then he got arrested for some improprieties in regards to his compensation, and then he escaped and he's in Lebanon. I guess that's the summary of the whole book.
Yes, very good. Yes, that really does sum it up. He started, of course, just as the CEO of Nissan, and he had come from Renault, which bought a controlling stake in Nissan. What people tend to forget is that Renault took a big chance coming into Japan and putting down $5 billion in an investment in a company that was clearly failing was a big risk. And the Nissan people and the Japanese people tend to forget that nowadays because Nissan is today the bigger player within the alliance, even though it has less financial say in the running of the alliance. So Renault comes in and they make this investment. They put in Carlos Gohsm, who had been with Renault not all that long, and he takes over as CEO of Nissan eventually after about a year. And then later, he becomes the CEO of Renault. And you can argue that's where some of the problems started to develop. Here he is now CEO of two companies, each with their own interests in some ways. And he has to adjudicate and make decisions on behalf of both companies and the alliance. And as you say, he then adds Mitsubishi, another smaller Japanese automaker in the mix, becomes head of Mitsubishi. And then suddenly, or apparently suddenly, here he is arrested. Now, in a lot of jurisdictions, say the US, it probably would have been an administrative charge, a complaint from the Securities and Exchange Commission, which indeed there was in this case as well. But to arrest someone, put them in detention, withhold the right of people to see them, right? For a few days, he was not able to see anyone. He had to go find lawyers for himself. All of this was a shock to everybody, and then opened a lot of eyes about Japan's judicial system. And as you say, he then, just as amazingly, after this shocking arrest, he's running his court case, he looks at it, and suddenly disappears from the country.
Well, part of the things that create some irritation, both in France and in Japan, is that not only he's getting two salaries, but he's getting two huge salaries. I mean, in the standard of Japan's CEO salaries and the standard of France CEO salaries, he is outdo them both, and he's getting those two salaries, and that seems to bother a lot of people. He tried to compare himself with the international CEO, but I wonder, first of all, how much of a salary was he getting, just to get a perspective of the money that we're talking about?
Yes, that's a good question. It varied a lot, actually, and so therefore becomes a complicated question, and indeed is one of the key charges against him, whether he was booking what would we call postponed compensation or not, right? And so that is a key issue in the case. In very rough terms, at his peak, he was making probably around $26 million a year. It depends on whether you put in stock options or incentive programs similar to stock options. And so that complicates the number. Also, his salary at Renault changed over the years. There was opposition from the French government to how much he was making at Renault. But Nissan was, for the most of the time, was a much larger part of his salary package. So around, easy to say, 25, 30 million was probably the peak number, depending how you account for it.
That's from Nissan or from Nissan?
That's from everybody. Okay, that would be the total number. Towards the end, his salary at base pay at Renault was actually around €1 million a year. Okay. Which is not very much for running a company that size. Earlier years, his variable compensation had pushed that up as high as 6-7 million euros.
Right, and to put that into context, for example, the CEO of Ford Motors is getting $17 million in salary. The CEO of General Motors, Maria Barra, I think is her name, is getting $21 million. So if we compare it to international levels, it doesn't seem to be so outrageous, but in national levels, as in Japan, it's just outrageous.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And don't forget, those numbers actually probably, I haven't looked at them, probably exclude long-term incentives, which are a big part of any CEO's pay. And whether that's justified or not is a big debate, within sort of both business and social world. Should these people get these big stock option payouts that can double your salary very easily? So yes, in global terms, it was certainly not outrageous, and indeed was still below some of the competition. Also, what Ghosn looked at to some extent, we think, was not just what happens in the auto industry, but in other industries. If you look in the financial services industry, these numbers are nothing. A high-flying trader on Wall Street or a very successful M&A banker can make a lot more money than this. So your global peers becomes an issue. So if Ghosn really was concerned about whether he was properly rewarded for his work, he probably picked, number one, the wrong industry.
Mm.
Number two, he certainly picked the wrong two countries in which to do business. And he said, a number of times in interviews, I could have left, right? I could have gone to GM. Well, why didn't you?
Right.
If you're really that upset about it, then go ahead and leave and start over again.
Okay, well, look, if I ever had $1 million, that would be enough for me to live for the rest of my life. Now, these CEOs, rockstar CEOs, are getting in excess of $20 million a year, so they don't need that money to make a living. So it becomes a matter of ego, who earns more, because he's not gonna struggle to pay his rent because he's getting, I don't know, 50 million instead of 20 million. So I just try to think of how, of course, it has to be an ego thing to look for this kind of compensation and to ask for more, because in addition to that, he had Nissan paying some of his personal expenses as well.
Well, yes. And, as you say, it becomes not just ego, but your peer group.
Mm.
When you live a lifestyle like that, you do spend a lot of money, right? Costs do go up. You don't have the same amount of time that other people have to go do grocery shopping, et cetera. So things get much more expensive. And, if you want to do a party at Versailles for your wife, $600,000, well, your million just got shot, right? Pretty quickly. So I think it was around 300,000, not confirmed, but that was the approximate number, around $300,000 for a party one night at Versailles. That's a lot of money, obviously a big cost. But, the number does become sort of meaningless to some extent, as you say, after a certain range. Also, you talked about the companies paying things. In Japan, that's very common. So for any foreign executive coming in, their apartment will usually be will be rent-free. They will usually have their taxes paid for by the company, which is pretty nice. So it's called net tax package. So the money you get, they will cover any taxes that are associated with it. This is all quite common in Japan and substitutes to some extent for those low salary numbers that you see. The fringe benefits are usually pretty high.
When you speak to fringe benefits, I think of Donald Trump and his financial advisor, who is in trouble for getting fringe benefits as well.
Well, that's an interesting case, actually, because in Japan, that stuff would not be taxable. A lot of the benefit that he received from these various programs would not be taxable in Japan. It would be seen as part of the cost of the company. So one of the things that we point out in the book is that regulations vary widely from country to country.
Okay, well, the last question, because I'm not going to keep you any longer. So he escapes, he's in Lebanon. If you and you cannot tell the future, but in your mind, how is this going to resolve itself?
Very good question as well. We didn't expect any of the things that we've seen already. So probably you cannot rule out the incredibly unexpected in this. Maybe he comes back to Japan sometime in some way, right? The Taylors, the father and son who helped him flee Japan, are back in court now. They're to be sentenced later this month. So I think that's an unlikely outcome. Possibly more likely is that he's being investigated by the French authorities. If he comes to terms with them and they perhaps allow him to enter France, or at least to transit out of Lebanon, maybe he could end up in Brazil. While Japan would have slightly more power in trying to extradite him from Brazil or France, it would still be pretty difficult. It's not that easy to get extradition. Japan has formal extradition treaties with only two countries, South Korea and the United States. So I think it's possible over time that Ghosn could rehabilitate enough of his reputation, settle enough charges that he can probably go to some other part of the world, but will always be, to some extent, a fugitive from Japanese justice. They will not be able to drop the case completely. So that he'll always be in sort of this gray zone.
Well, it is a thrilling, amazing story. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow you or follow the work that you do?
Oh, that's very kind. Thanks. Yes, it's called Collision Course because it's not just Ghosn colliding with the Japanese judicial system. It's a lot of collisions between Renault and Nissan, the French government's Japanese government. The subtitle, to try and explain it a bit more, is Carlos Gohsm and the Culture Wars that upended an auto empire. So the idea of the cross-cultural issues between French and Japanese companies. And at one point, the Renault, Nissan, Mitsubishi empire was the largest automaker in the world. So it's an amazing collection. In terms of following us, we're both my author, Hans Greimel, who is the real expert in all of these areas in terms of following Nissan and the auto industry for many years now. He's the editor for Automotive News for Asia. So you can follow Hans or myself on Facebook or Twitter, LinkedIn. For myself, the book is available from Harvard Business Review Press. So any of the normal sort of online sites will show it.
William, thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you very much. It was very fun.